A young cop gets dragged into an FBI investigation of a brilliant serial killer. Welcome back to Movies Explained. Today's film is an action thriller from 2023 titled To Catch a Killer. The movie begins during New Year's Eve in the city of Baltimore, where the citizens are enjoying themselves in anticipation of the new year. When the clock strikes 12, they all cheer along with the many fireworks throughout the city. That is until their cheers turn into screams of horror as one by one, people from around the city get shot and killed from seemingly nowhere. Somewhere in the city, a young female cop named Eleanor Falco takes a call of disturbance from a diner owner who wants one of the drunk customers to be removed from his diner. After arguing with the owner about the necessity of doing so, Eleanor gets a call about an emergency. She heads to one of the shooting victim's locations, trying to calm down the wife and daughter of the victim before police investigations begin. Eleanor and another officer investigate the scene and use a laser beam to approximate where the shot came from. They pinpointed a specific flat in a nearby building, but just as they were about to investigate further, the flat blew up unexpectedly. They evacuate the building, but Eleanor instructs other officers to record the civilians evacuating in case they might record the murder suspect's face. She then runs upstairs through all the smoke to witness the other officers breaking their way into the flat. Eleanor tries to follow, but she ends up passing out near the window. She wakes up to a fellow cop putting an oxygen mask on her before a paramedic takes over. She tries to act fine, but the paramedic insists that she rest before heading downstairs again. Meanwhile, Detective Jack McKenzie, who helped Eleanor earlier, briefs the investigation's leader about the flat owner's identity, a Norwegian who received the flat as a debt repayment and has never even been there himself. Suddenly, a firework explodes nearby, shocking all the officers at the scene before the city council informs that they'll shut off the rest of the pre-programmed fireworks. Then, Eleanor notices the police dog barking towards the toilet, which is also noticed by the leader. He instructs the team to remove the whole toilet as evidence before he instructs Eleanor to leave the scene. The next morning, Chief Jackson announces that Special Agent Lamarck from the FBI's Baltimore field office is joining the investigation as the leader who told Eleanor to leave last night. Lamarck made a speech and pep talk to prepare the officers for the investigation they were about to launch. He says that the killer, who murdered 29 people last night, is a professional who doesn't want to get caught as he left no trace evidence of his identity. However, they must not focus on a typical preconception of a mass murderer such as a Nazi or a terrorist. Instead, they should keep their minds open, as the killer is just another person. On the sideline, Eleanor watches his speech silently. Then, when she's distributing some coffee, she overhears Lamarck and Jesse Capleton from the governor's office debate about closing down the highway. It seems that Capleton is only concerned about the governor's good image rather than catching the killer. In the pantry, Eleanor is chatting with a fellow cop when she says that what the killer did is more similar to them swatting mosquitoes instead of being pure evil. Lamarck, who overhears her, asks why she thinks so. She explains that based on her feelings, the killer is looking for relief instead of destruction and only stopped killing because he's had his fill for the night. However, she thinks he might do it again. Seeming satisfied by her answer, Lamarck introduces himself before leaving. Early the next morning, Eleanor gets a call from Chief Jackson saying that Lamarck wants to meet her at a cafe very soon. So she rushes there to find the man having another argument with Capleton, who wants to keep the beaches open despite a mass killer on the loose. Again, his priorities seem to lie only on the governor's success. After Capleton leaves, Eleanor joins Lamarck for coffee. He thinks that Eleanor can figure out the killer quite well, either because she's a good detective or she's just as sick in the head as they are. Then, Jack comes in, and Lamarck reveals that he wants them both on his team for this investigation as a liaison between the Baltimore Police Department and Lamarck himself. The three head to the police station for a briefing with other members of the investigation team. Their only lead at the time was to call in the painters who worked on the bombed flat 2 years ago. Another member, Krupp, mentions that the counterterrorism unit is running through the background checks at the request of Frank Graber, another FBI agent. This upsets Lamarck, and he reminds the room that he's in charge of the operation, and everything must be approved by him. Then a woman brings a document for Lamarck to sign from Capleton on his agreement to not impose a curfew, which is exactly what he doesn't agree to, yet he signs it anyway. Marquand continues the brief by informing that the weapon used was an antique M21 sniper rifle, which is older than the firearms database, causing another problem for the team. Eleanor points out that the arsenal keepers may lead them to another clue, so Lamarck orders the team to look into it. On their way to the morgue, Eleanor mentions that Lamarck seems upset about other teams joining, but Jack says it's common, as cases tend to derail when multiple teams are involved. In the morgue, the three look astounded at the number of victims that are now right in front of them. Lamarck starts asking the two cops about their assumptions of the killer. They both think it's a man, and he's either military trained or in high-level sports. But Eleanor thinks the victims are spontaneous decisions because there is no pattern. Lamarck also thinks that the killer is not seeking others' suffering, as all the victims were killed in one shot, so he must be trying to disrupt the behavior of society. They're interrupted by a cop saying that they found the killer, so they rush to the scene where Agent Frank Graber is heading the operation. He says they found a kid in the apartment building who refused to be questioned and threatened to kill everyone after locking himself in his room. Lamarck thinks it's a bad move, especially since they're not sure the kid even has a weapon. They watch the team bust down the apartment door, and the kid starts throwing stuff at them before breaking the window and throwing himself out. Lamarck is pissed off at the rash decision made by Graber and Capleton, who are still too prideful to admit their mistake. Back at the station, the Lamarck and the two cops start questioning the flat's painters. One of them, Rodney Lang, brings his baby boy because his wife is working. One by one, the painters are questioned about their connection to the bombing and the killer, but nobody seems to know anything since they did the job a couple of years ago. Meanwhile, Eleanor watches all the details of the painters to assess the situation before Lamarck asks her to take the baby with her outside, as it's distracting. Sometime later, after Eleanor receives a lab report that indicates the killer is a vegan, Lamarck approaches her and gets angry because she doesn't give the report straight to him. While she walks back home, Lamarck apologizes for snapping at her and invites her over to his house for dinner and to run through new evidence. At first, she refuses, thinking that Lamarck is just hitting on her, but he says he's married. In the car, Lamarck talks about how he feels bound by Capleton because his influence can lead to Lamarck getting fired before they look into the new evidence. However, Lamarck mentions that he knows Eleanor was rejected when applying to the FBI, and though she thinks it doesn't matter, Lamarck says it does since they're under the microscope by the FBI and the police department. Lamarck keeps pushing Eleanor for the reason she became a cop, her two honest answers during the FBI application, why she didn't go to college, and all her other triggers until she breaks down and reveals her self-inflicted scars. She is struggling with depression, and Lamarck wants this to be her fuel in understanding the killer and getting them more leads. In a mall, a mysterious man steals someone's clothes, starts bathing in the public toilet sink, and unabashedly collects the leftover vegetables from the cafeteria tables. The security guards approach him. He is asked to open his bag, but he refuses, saying he just wants to go home. After being pushed more, the man takes a gun out and starts shooting. Eleanor, who is at an antique gun store for the investigation, is called to the scene. She arrives at the security room to join the others in trying to get a glimpse of the man's face, which they find impossible to do. Eleanor notices the man only picking vegetables from the table, confirming the lab report they received the other day for the killer. They then watch him kill the guards and the ladies who mocked him before walking away and killing the officers who arrive at the scene. Eleanor and Lamarck make the observation that the killer doesn't want to engage, but he also uses a weapon like an extension of himself, noting that he may be born among skilled shooters. The killer also used grenades to blow up the remaining officers that were pursuing him. Outside the mall, Lamarck sees Capleton coming in with a chopper and immediately orders Eleanor and Jack to find the shirt that was used by the killer. After cheering on the leader, the cops go to a landfill where the trash from the mall has been dumped earlier. They painstakingly search the shirt by hand. Meanwhile, at the station, Graber and Capleton have the idea to show the footage of the killer on a popular television show in hopes that someone would recognize him. Lamarck thinks it's a horrible idea, but Lamarck's boss, Nathan Bowen, says that he must play along with their decision or risk being fired. Just as Lamarck argues back, Jack comes in bringing the shirt they're looking for. The team looks through the arsenal keeper's data and receives a lab report that the killer might have received serious head trauma in the past. Ultimately, The mall footage is now being televised, and the host asks for anyone who knows the killer to call into their show. People start calling in for unrelated reasons until one person claims to be the killer and that he's part of a shadow army. The officers manage to triangulate the caller's position, so they rush there to bust him, despite Lamarck and Eleanor thinking that it's not the actual killer. The caller is in a corner store with his friends, and to prepare for the operation, Jack, Marquand, and Eleanor get all the other civilians out. Eleanor has a hard time convincing an old man to leave before the caller and his friends notice that they're being targeted. A shootout happens, killing most of the guys except for one man who gets tased by another cop. Unfortunately, the arrested man reveals that the call is just a prank gone wrong, and they have nothing to do with the killer or any shadow army. In the station the next day, Lamarck is being questioned about the failed operation. He explains that it's not his idea, and he's actually completely against it. But since he is the head of the operation, he must approve every action and thus receive the consequences as well. The televised footage caused many civilian casualties, even outside the failed operation. They then bring up Eleanor's failed FBI assessment to try and undermine her work, but Lamarck stands up for her by saying she has great potential. However, he still winds up getting fired, and he is joined for some drinks by Eleanor and Jack. Feeling guilty, Eleanor returns home and fights the urge to hurt herself again. After taking a bath and pondering, she realizes something and heads to Rodney the painter's house. She accuses him of outsourcing his part of the flat's painting job because she analyzed his income record, which shows he has taken another job by a different company at the same time. After being yelled at by his wife, Rodney admits the truth to Eleanor, who is joined by Lamarck. He says he gave the flat's painting job to an ex-convict by the name of Dean. Dean told him that he became a vegan after working in a slaughterhouse downstate, so they brought in a sketch artist for Rodney to picture what Dean looked like before Lamarck and Eleanor headed to the 3 slaughterhouses in that area. They bring the sketch, asking people whether they know this man who worked there some time ago, until one woman recognizes him as Dean Posse. She tells the cops a story about how Dean was bullied while working there by a man who ended up falling into the meat grinder while he was on a shift with Dean. Dean said that the man tripped, but they all knew he was the one who did it. This is what led to his conviction for 2 years. In the car, Eleanor reads out Dean's info and finds out that his father was a shooting instructor in the army, who later became an arsenal keeper, explaining Dean's access to antique guns. Dean also got head trauma in his childhood from a gunshot. They don't have his contact or address, but they pull up at Dean's mother's house. Before heading out, Eleanor wants to call Jack for backup, but Lamarck says no since it might lead to the others butting in and ruining their lead. Lamarck gets out when another vehicle stops behind them, driven by Mrs. Posse. She refuses to cooperate at first, but after saying that they can capture Dean alive, she invites them inside. Mrs. Posse explains that after an accident at the shooting range, where Jack was shot by his father, he turned into a loner who hated the world. Dean received shooting training from his father, who wanted to secure a place for him in the army, but he didn't get accepted because he wasn't a violent person at the time. Then Eleanor notices a cabin nearby, but it's too late since Lamarck gets shot from that cabin. While panicking, Eleanor instructs Mrs. Posse to grab their guns and phones to show Dean that they're trying to help him. Mrs. Posse goes out to the yard and yells at Dean to stop, saying that if he doesn't go with Eleanor, then he should join her in heaven before she shoots herself in the head. Dean, who witnessed it all, comes out and approaches the house with his rifle. He enters, puts away his rifle, and grabs a handgun before sitting in front of Eleanor. They start conversing, as Dean tells her why he did what he did, and she tries to convince him that she can help because she is also struggling like Dean. In the end, Dean seems to trust her and wants her to shoot him once he falls asleep beside his mother, which she agrees to do. Unfortunately, Dean hears police sirens and thinks that Eleanor is setting him up, so he drags her to the cabin and ties her to a pole with a zip tie. While he goes back and forth killing the oncoming officers, Eleanor desperately tries to stop him using her words and fights to break the zip tie. She stops him and forces him to hug her as the officers surround the cabin. She promises to get the help he needs once he surrenders, but after he presses a button to detonate the bombs nearby, she bites his neck and causes him to bleed out. Dean gets away and aims the gun at her, but decides not to shoot and to walk away. The cops eventually find him sitting by a wall, limp and drained of blood before they shoot him multiple times. Meanwhile, Eleanor manages to free herself and is helped out by Jack. Sometime later in Nathan Bowen's office, Eleanor is given a document to sign for the operation to remain classified in return for an intelligence analyst position at the FBI. She refuses, saying that her silence for their incompetence won't be bought. Capleton mentions that what she did with Lamarck was illegal because they were acting without authority, so Eleanor seems to reconsider the offer. She wants Lamarck to be given a posthumous Medal of Valor, which is agreed by Bowen. She also wants to be a special agent instead of an analyst, and they agree. The movie ends with Eleanor shaking hands with Capleton before heading home, reminiscing on Lamarck's words. Thanks for watching.